favorite exercises for the glutes is a hyperextension. The thing about the hyperextension is that it's not exclusively a glute movement. It actually engages the majority of the posterior chain, including the erector spinae, the hamstrings, and the calves to a certain degree. This is why when I am performing a hyperextension to target the glutes, I do a specific variation of the movement in an effort to recruit more of the glute muscles over some of the other muscles that the hyperextension does actually target. But because this is a movement that does target the majority of the posterior chain, it means that we have to be really particular about how we perform the movement in order to maximize glute recruitment. And again, this is not the ideal variation of the movement. It's totally fine for you to target the back, the hamstrings, the calves with this movement. But if you are trying to focus on glute growth with this movement, here are some tricks to help you with really optimizing the movement for glute bias. Number one complaint I hear from people when they are performing a hyperextension is that they feel it in their back. Now, like we talked about, this movement does work the back, so it is okay and it is appropriate for you to feel some back tension. And if you are trying to build up that muscle that runs along your spine, this is a great way to do it. But if that isn't your goal, here are some things that will help you with eliminating some of that back discomfort or back tension that you might be feeling to really focus on the hip. So the first thing that you need to make sure of is that you need to make sure that the platform is at the right height. So if the pads on the hyperextension platform are too high, it's going to force the back to go into a little too much flexion. And so the majority of the movement is going to be occurring at the back and not at the hips, where the glutes will be predominantly responsible for the movement. For most people, this means that you're probably going to want to put the hyperextension machine on the lowest setting. For some taller people, you may want to have it on a higher setting, but generally speaking, the lower you can put it, the more optimally placed it's going to be. Ideally, you want the top of the pad to hit somewhere around the widest point of your hips. Now, I am aware of the fact that for a lot of people that are on the shorter side, this may not be possible. You may not be able to set the hyperextension low enough to be able to keep it below the top point of your hips. So I do actually have some alternatives that I will be showing at the end of the video. Now that you have your platform at the right height, you're gonna step onto the platform, you're gonna keep your feet at the back edge of the platform. You're gonna slightly turn your toes out, but not excessively. And you're gonna sink into your knees as you lay your hips onto the pad. The reason I suggest sinking into your knees is that for myself and a lot of the people that I work with, we have a tendency to feel a lot of sensation in the back of the legs when the legs are locked out. And this can cause you to fatigue a lot earlier and not actually train close enough to failure for the glutes in particular when those knees are really straight. At the end of the day, our hamstrings are still going to be very active during this movement. No matter what we do, we're going to recruit a lot of hamstrings during this movement. But what I find is that when that sensation is so excessive, it makes it harder to train as effectively when all you're doing is experiencing this overwhelming sensation in the back of your legs. It feels like your hamstrings are just absolutely done. By keeping the knees slightly bent, it helps to reduce a little bit of the sensation that you experience in the hamstring area in an effort to really make sure that you are pushing your glutes as much as possible. Now, a lot of people tend to struggle with feeling sensation in their glutes during this movement. So a couple things I want to note on that. First of all, sensation is not necessarily indicative of muscular tension. Just because we feel a movement in a certain area doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to translate to hypertrophy. So that's the first thing I want you to keep in mind. The second thing is I want you to focus on some cues that have really helped me and a lot of my clients to at least increase the sensation that they feel in their glutes during this movement. So the first one is to think about hip thrusting the pad. So instead of thinking about like pulling your shoulders up, I really want you to think about driving your hips into the pad. And then the second suggestion I have is very similar, and I want you to think when you are fully extended at the top, I want you to think about tucking your tailbone under. This is called a posterior tilt, and what that's going to do is it's just going to really make sure that you are engaging in that full lockout, that full extension at the hip, and hopefully that should make sure that even if you're not experiencing the sensation, you are definitely recruiting the glutes during that full extension. Now, a very commonly given recommendation is to keep the upper body and the shoulders really, really rounded over during this movement. Now, I don't necessarily think this is a bad cue, but I have leaned away from this cue as I have worked with this movement more and I've worked with multiple clients longer. I think that if you are experiencing a lot of sensation in your erectors, in your back during this movement, it can be helpful to kind of move away from that overwhelming sensation in your back, kind of like how we avoided the overwhelming sensation in the hamstrings. But at the end of the day, I do think that that excessive rounding prevents us from engaging in that full extension that we really want to achieve. The idea behind this movement is that hip extension, that hip hyperextension, is where the glutes are really reaching their peak tension. They're in the shortened position, and so you fully extend, which is going to be really hard to do if you're forcing your back to curve. When we fully extend, the glutes are working really, really hard to achieve that. So if you want to start off with the movement with a rounded back, with really rounding over to keep your back out of it, you can. But I recommend actually working through this with a slightly more neutral position. This is going to build up your back muscle a little bit, and I think ultimately that is conducive to progress in the long run. It's a really, really important muscle to have built up for a number of compound movements, as well as this movement in particular. But I do think that even if we are, I still experiencing a little bit of sensation in my erectors at this point in time, but it is much more a glute dominant movement now that I've built up that muscle a little bit and I've really perfected my technique in, again, keeping the upper body in more of a neutral position. When it comes to adding weight to this movement, I think this is really up to personal preference. I personally like to hold a plate at about shoulder height. Some people prefer to hold a plate a little bit further away from their body. This is kind of going to depend on the equipment that you have access to. If your hyperextension is low to the ground, that's going to be challenging. Some people also like to use a barbell. You could also use a dumbbell. You could also just do this with body weight. It is still a significantly challenging movement with just body weight, especially if you're just starting out. So there's a couple different ways that you can bear weight with this movement. Again, always we want to focus on progressively overloading, so increasing the number of reps, the number of sets, or the weight that we're bearing for a movement. And we always want to focus on training close to or to failure for the majority of our working sets. Okay, now let's get into some alternatives for my fun size friends who either don't have access to a hyperextension machine, or if you, again, are on the shorter side and the hyperextension machine does not go low enough. The first one I would suggest is setting up a Smith machine, or you could also do this on a barbell rack, but the barbell rack, it's gonna depend on how the actual hooks are set up. It might roll around on you. So I definitely suggest the Smith machine. You're gonna wanna set it again to a height that's probably a little bit lower than that hip height that we talked about before, because you're gonna be leaning over the bar. So I would say think about like the top of the thighs for placement for the bar. You are gonna wanna put some kind of padding on the bar. So you're gonna wanna get a barbell pad, or maybe wrap a yoga mat around it, because you are gonna be driving your hips into that bar and it's not gonna be comfortable if you don't have some kind of padding. This is the tricky part to this variation, is gonna be your feet. Because we don't have anything behind our feet or behind our legs, we really have to keep our toes secure on the ground. And I do recommend kind of going on your toes for this movement. It can cause a little bit more tension in the calves by doing this, but ultimately, again, this is a posterior chain movement. It does kind of work the calves to a degree, so that's okay in my opinion. So I like to actually go on my toes. I like to really dig my toes into the ground, and then I lean forward onto the pad. I would say that I probably never end up at a full 45 degrees like you would with an actual hyperextension machine, just because that really makes you feel like you're gonna fall forward. I probably am closer to like 60 degrees. And this allows me to at least get a certain level of that forward lean without making me feel like I'm gonna fall forward. Again, you can bear weight with this. You could use a dumbbell, you can use a plate, whatever works for you, or you can do it with body weight. And then just like with the other movement, or with the other machine, we're gonna be really focusing on driving our hips into the pad, really thinking about keeping our upper body in more of a neutral position and fully extending at the top. The last alternative, and this is actually my personal favorite way of doing this movement, is using a seated leg curl machine. You could potentially do this with a leg extension. It just kind of depends on how the machine is set up. The one thing that you do need to check though is you need to make sure that the machine itself is either heavy enough or is drilled into the ground to prevent it from falling forward. So what I do is I set it up so that the padding on the machine itself is set to, again, about that top of the thigh height. and then you're gonna put your body over that pad that you would normally be using on the back of your calves for something like a hamstring curl. There are also some lying hamstring curls that I've used this for. You're gonna do basically what you did with the Smith machine is you're gonna lean forward. Again, you're probably not gonna achieve a full 45 degrees, but what I have found is that a lot of these machines have a stand that hold up the seat of the machine, where you would normally be sitting if you were using like a seated hamstring curl. That stand is a really nice place for you to prop your heels up on. And that will give you a lot more security than the Smith machine would, in that it doesn't have anything to hold your feet or hold your legs. But if you have the ideal circumstances for this alternative, this variation is actually my favorite variation of the three. My notes on the hyperextension, especially for the glutes. If you guys have any suggestions for what other exercises you'd like me to break down, I'm thinking I'm just gonna deep dive some of my favorite, not necessarily glute exercises. If you guys want me to talk about back exercises or shoulder exercises, I feel like this platform is a lot easier to really do a full deep dive and do form tips and corrections on. So if you guys have suggestions for what movements you would like me to do next, just let me know in the comments.